Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I rise to speak on the Veterans Entitlements, Treatment and Support Simplification and Harmonisation Bill of 2024. And, Deputy Speaker, I just want to first acknowledge that I have Holsworthy military barracks in my electorate, and the area of Holsworthy supports many of our veterans, former veterans, and also houses many veterans' families. Deputy Speaker, how we look after those who have put their own lives on the line for the sake of us and so that we can enjoy those freedoms that we cherish in Australia. How we treat returned veterans really determines our soul as a society, and we have never really got it right. The system is often extremely bureaucratic. We have failed many veterans who have returned from overseas duties, who have returned very different to the way that they left, and we have not properly addressed the areas of not just physical health they often suffer from, but particularly mental health, suicidality, and in too many instances, suicide itself. And so when we look at what sort of changes we can make to veterans affairs and how we support our veterans, Deputy Speaker, I share in common with the honourable member for Nichols a love of the West Wing, and there is a part in the West Wing where Toby Ziegler and President Bartlett are speaking about veterans' entitlements. And at that time, Toby is trying to obtain a wheelchair for a former veteran whose wheelchair is broken. And he says to the President, is there somebody that I can just speak to that can get this wheelchair problem fixed? And Bartlett says, yes, we have to straighten out the system. Then he goes on to say, after the Civil War, veterans had to come to DC to get their pensions. They had to visit the office personally. They waited for a clerk to look through all of the Civil War papers until these were found. Do you know what the papers were bound in, Toby? No, Mr. President. Red tape. But the President then says that's where red tape, the expression red tape, came from. I'm not sure that I agree with President Bartlett on that, Deputy Speaker. Having been a lawyer, I believe that the red tape actually originated a lot earlier in England with legal briefs. But there we have it, red tape, and there has been far too much red tape in the past applied to veterans' interests and veterans' affairs. So, Deputy Speaker, this bill addresses recommendation 1 that came from the Royal Commission into Defence and Veteran Suicide, the interim report. And that recommendation was to simplify and harmonise veteran compensation and rehabilitation legislation. And the recommendation was further articulated or particularised to say the Australian government should develop and implement legislation to simplify and harmonise the framework for veterans' compensation, rehabilitation and other entitlements by no later than early 2024. The Australian government should present to the Parliament and seek passage of its bill for the proposed framework, and if the legislation is passed, the Australian government should, by no later than the 1st of July 2024, begin the process of implementing and transitioning to the new legislative framework. And so, Deputy Speaker, the last recommendation around timing was that if the legislation is passed, the Australian government should ensure that by no later than 1 July 2025, the new legislation has fully commenced and is fully operational. So, Deputy Speaker, although we now have legislation, thankfully, before the House, the government is very late in introducing this bill. And if it's unable to implement the first recommendation of the interim report, what guarantee or hope do we have for any of the other recommendations, bearing in mind that this government has now been in power for 2.5 years? So the proposed commencement date of 1 July 2026 that's in this legislation is a year later than the Royal Commission into Defence and Veterans Suicide recommended, and 4 years after the Royal Commission's interim report, which recommended this urgent course of action. Deputy Speaker, the Vietnam Veterans Association of Australia, for example, wants the implementation date to be brought forward to the earliest date practicable. The organisation estimates that at least 2,000 Vietnam veterans will pass between the passage of the bill and 1 July 2026. So, Deputy Speaker, while I commend the government for finally bringing this legislation, I say that it has been delayed unreasonably and with no sensible explanation given from the Minister or the Prime Minister as to why it has been so delayed. The former coalition government committed $174 million in the 21-22 budget for the first 2 years of the Royal Commission into Defence and Veterans Suicide, including $28 million for the Department of Veterans Affairs to be resourced to respond to information requests from the Commission. And as I said, the interim report was handed down in August 22 and included a summary of work undertaken and 13 recommendations to address on an urgent basis, 3 of which were veteran compensation and rehabilitation, improving the claims processing of the DVA, and also various procedural matters. And what we have found since then has been a significant delay on the part of the government, and I think that it is important that we to emphasise to the House the importance of introducing or legislating the recommendations. I just want to take the Deputy Speaker through a couple of the facts and figures that came out of the report. 1,677 veteran suicides between 1997 and 2021. But it is estimated that the true number of veteran suicides in the same time frame is more than 3,000. Deputy Speaker, there is more chance of a veteran suiciding than dying serving our nation, and of course every death is a tragedy. Over the course of the Royal Commission, there were more than 5,800 submissions received, 12 public hearings, 894 private sessions, and the Commission heard from very traumatised veterans' families. So, Deputy Speaker, while it is good that this legislation is now before the House, there have been many ways over the past 2.5 years that the Albanese Labor government has failed our veterans, and it's simply not good enough. For example, there's no voice for veterans in Cabinet. The first decision, when Anthony Albanese became Prime Minister, was to dump the Minister for Veterans Affairs from Cabinet. I hear some interjections over there, but I don't think that can be denied. There have also been no additional continuation of the veteran wellbeing centres, the veterans and family hubs that were established under the coalition government. And then I think we also need to look at some of the responses from industry and from various veterans groups around this legislation, Deputy Speaker. And what we have seen, first of all, from the member for New England, he commended the bill, but he said the 3 acts, as they become more aligned, we hope will remove the confusions and frustrations people have in wanting to get something resolved, dealing with the department and then just waiting in perpetuity for some outcome. And in his speech, the member for New England emphasised the importance of the Senate committee inquiry into the bill and the need for the inquiry to make time to hear from those, particularly in regional areas. So if we start to look at some of the positions of other major interest groups, the Department of Veterans Affairs published a legislation reform process and also anonymised many of its submissions. The Returned and Services League of Australia, the RSL, submission to the inquiry was broadly supportive of the proposed reforms, but included some specific issues of concern, such as there's no definition of veteran included, despite the Department of Veterans Affairs website suggestion that it should be included. There's a lack of clarity as to whether new claims could be made for the Veteran Home Care Program by those ineligible for other home and household service programs. The way the overall impairments are measured under other legislation seems to make it harder for some veterans currently covered by the legislation and compensation following a deterioration of their original condition. The veteran, as I said, the Vietnam Veterans Association of Australia agreed with the concept of the bill and its main thrust. However, the submission noted that the association does not agree that there is any significant simplification in the ongoing compensation legislation. So there are concerns around this legislation. The Vietnam Veterans Federation of Australia issued a newsletter in July 2024 and said the Federation's submission on the exposure draft of the bill, they were broadly supportive of the proposed reforms, however raised some concerns with specific elements of the bill, including how statements of principle are applied. For example, the Australian Peacekeeper and Peacemaker Veterans Association was critical of the legislation. They said it still remains far too complex. The Legacy Australia outlined a number of measures it supported, but then raised concerns with some aspects and made suggestions for improvements. Particularly, Legacy raised concerns over the use of the term wholly dependent partner and eligibility for some of the compensation provisions based on whether a person was economically dependent on the veteran prior to their death. And Deputy Speaker, if we look then at the TPI Federation of Australia, which is a totally and permanently incapacitated federation, they represent a group of veterans in receipt of the special rate of disability compensation under the Veterans Entitlement Act and their families, and they were very critical of many aspects of the proposed reform. They said that the proposed changes are not actually intended to alleviate suicidal ideation, but rather tries to address issues that the government and the bureaucracy has with the legislation. They went on to say this simplification is for the purpose of administration and not for the benefit of veterans and their families. So you'll see through this, Defence Families Australia, for example, said that while the changes had been made are late and may assist in simplifying an unnecessarily complex legislative framework, they were critical of many of the changes that are supposed to protect and uphold the entitlements and dignity of veterans and their families. So I also just want to note the comments of one of my constituents, Gwen Chern, who was the Veteran Family Advocate Commissioner. She made a submission to the Senate Committee Inquiry, and she raised some concerns with the bill. The use of the term wholly dependent partner, suggesting bereaved family member, would be clearer and more inclusive. She said it wasn't completely addressing funereal inequities, and she was advocating for more support, such as a gold card to carers of veterans before the veteran dies. I also want to mention the Australian War Widows. I've launched functions for them. They raised concern with the use of the term wholly dependent partner. And I also just want to mention one of my other constituents, Bree Teal, who has set up a group called CIPHER, which stands for Creative, Integrative and Peer-Led Housing, Education and Research. And Bree had her partner, her husband, was killed in overseas while she was pregnant with her son. So Bree has been a fierce advocate for veterans' families and particularly for veterans' children in circumstances where those veterans have died in service. So Deputy Speaker, to conclude, the legislation as such is supported.
Authorised. Jenny Ware, Liberal Party, Sutherland.